family approves or not. He said it standing in a room full of men who had spent their whole lives being right, and not one of them argued with him because they had never once seen Antonio Rossi look at anyone the way he looked at her. Daisy Whitlock had worked in the Rossi household kitchens for 3 years, and in 3 years she had learned every single trick a plus-size woman develops to survive in a house full of beautiful, dangerous people who were never taught to be kind to anyone outside their bloodline. At 26, she was soft and round, in a way the magazines never celebrated. With strawberry blonde hair she kept tucked under a simple kitchen cap and an apron that hid most of her curves beneath flour and stubborn determination. She had grown up in Providence on a diet of second-hand clothes and her grandmother's recipes, and when the recipes turned into a real talent for cooking, a talent good enough to land her a position in one of the most feared households in Rhode Island, she had taken it without asking too many questions about who exactly she would be cooking for. She learned quickly that Antonio Rossi did not eat what the rest of the staff prepared for the family's standard meals. He had his own private chef rotation, men flown in from Italy who lasted weeks before quitting under the pressure of cooking for a man notoriously difficult to please, and Daisy had been warned repeatedly never to attempt anything for him directly unless specifically asked. She was asked finally, on a rainy Thursday in March, when the latest chef quit mid-shift after Antonio sent back his third attempt at a simple risotto, storming out of the kitchen with his knives still in his bag, leaving an entire household in a state of quiet panic because Antonio Rossi was hosting an unscheduled dinner for 2 visiting capos from New York in less than 90 minutes and currently had no one capable of feeding them. The head of staff, a tightly wound woman named Constance, turned to Daisy in desperation, having exhausted every other option in the building. "Can you cook something? Anything. He will not forgive an empty table tonight." Daisy did not have time to be nervous. She moved through the kitchen the way she had moved through her grandmother's kitchen her entire childhood, instinct over recipe, working with what was actually in the pantry instead of what some imported chef thought belonged there. 40 minutes later, she sent out a dish her grandmother used to make on Sunday afternoons, a rich braised short rib over creamy polenta, finished with a gremolata she threw together at the absolute last second, and held her breath in the kitchen doorway, waiting for the inevitable rejection. It never came. Instead, 20 minutes into the meal, Antonio Rossi walked into the kitchen himself, something the staff swore he had never once done in the 3 years Daisy had worked there, and found her scrubbing pans at the sink, certain she'd already lost her job before her shift even ended. "Who made the short rib?" he asked, his voice carrying the particular flatness Daisy had heard described in hushed kitchen gossip 100 times but never actually experienced directly. "I did, sir." "I'm sorry if it wasn't what you expected. I can make something else if—" "It was the best meal I have eaten in this house in 3 years, Antonio said, cutting her off, and something in his dark eyes shifted as he actually looked at her properly for the first time, taking in the flour on her apron, the soft curve of her cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove, the stubborn, exhausted determination still written across her face. "Why have I never had this before?" "Because nobody ever asked the kitchen staff, sir. We just cook what we're told to cook." "Then I am asking now," Antonio said. "Cook for me. Properly, starting tonight." What followed over the next several weeks was a quiet, careful courtship that neither of them named out loud, Antonio finding more and more reasons to walk into the kitchen at odd hours, lingering over conversations about ingredients that slowly became conversations about everything else, about her grandmother in Providence, about the empire he had inherited at 24 when his father was gunned down outside a restaurant in Federal Hill, about the loneliness neither of them had ever admitted to anyone else. Daisy found herself, against every warning she had absorbed in 3 years of careful staff gossip, falling for a man the rest of the world was terrified of. It came to a head on a night in early May, a rare evening when the house was empty of guests and most of the staff had been given the night off, and Antonio found her in the kitchen long after her shift had technically ended, simply because she preferred the quiet of the kitchen to her small staff quarters. He poured them both a glass of wine, sat across the worn wooden island from her, and for the first time in either of their lives, neither one of them found a single reason to maintain the distance they were supposed to keep. What happened that night was not something either of them planned, not something either of them regretted in the morning, but it was something Antonio left before fully discussing. Called away before dawn by an emergency at the docks that turned into a 6-week negotiation in Miami, he could not delegate to anyone else. A negotiation that determined whether an entire shipping route stayed under Rossi control or fell into the hands of a rival family. He left a note on her pillow that Daisy read so many times the ink began to smudge from her own fingers. "I will be back before you have time to miss me. Wait for me." She waited. 6 weeks turned into 8, and somewhere in that 8th week, Daisy Whitlock sat in a clinic 2 towns away, staring at a result she had no idea how to process, no idea how to explain to a man who had still not returned a single one of her calls. Calls she did not yet know were being deliberately blocked by someone inside the household. That someone was Cordelia, Antonio's older sister, a woman who had run the household's day-to-day affairs since their mother's death and harbored very specific, very rigid ideas about what kind of woman belonged at her brother's side, ideas that absolutely did not include a kitchen maid from Providence. Cordelia had intercepted Daisy's calls to Antonio's private line under the guise of protecting her brother from distraction during a delicate negotiation, certain that whatever had happened between them was a momentary lapse that would resolve itself once Antonio returned home and regained his senses. By the time Antonio finally returned, 11 weeks after he'd left, Daisy had given her notice, packed everything she owned into 2 suitcases, and was sitting in the Providence bus terminal, waiting for a bus that would take her back to her grandmother's house, certain that the man she loved had simply moved on the moment business called him away, certain that she would raise this child alone, the way generations of women in her family had quietly managed before her. Antonio walked into the house, exhausted and triumphant from a negotiation that had secured the Rossi family's shipping routes for another decade, and instead of the woman he had spent 11 weeks thinking about every single day, found Cordelia waiting nervously in the front hall, finally confessing under the weight of her own guilt that she had been blocking Daisy's calls, that Daisy had quit that very morning, that she had no idea where Daisy had gone. Antonio did not raise his voice. He simply went very still, the particular stillness that everyone in his organization had learned meant something far worse than shouting was coming, and turned to his cousin Vittorio, his second-in-command, with a single instruction. "Find her. I don't care what it costs or who you have to wake up to do it. Find her tonight." Daisy was sitting in the bus terminal, her suitcase between her feet and one hand resting, almost unconsciously, against the small swell of her stomach, when a black car pulled up outside and Vittorio walked toward her with the particular urgency of a man who knew exactly how much trouble he was in if he failed at this one task. "Mr. Rossi needs to see you. Now. I have nothing left to say to him. He has plenty to say to you," Vittorio said. "And I would strongly suggest you let him say it before you get on that bus, because he has not slept in 2 days, and he will not stop looking for you regardless of what you decide tonight." She let herself be driven back, too exhausted to keep fighting a current that seemed determined to pull her back into this world, no matter how hard she tried to leave it. Antonio was waiting in the same kitchen where everything had started, and the moment she walked through the door, the cold, controlled composure that had carried him through 11 weeks of brutal negotiation simply collapsed. "You were leaving," he said, "without telling me, without an address. I came home to find out you'd vanished and nobody could tell me why." "I called you every week for 2 months, Daisy said, her voice finally breaking after weeks of forcing herself to stay calm. "You never called back. I thought that was your answer." "I never received a single one of those calls," Antonio said, something furious and devastated moving behind his eyes. Cordelia intercepted them. "I found out 20 minutes ago. Daisy, I would have come home the same night if I had known you were trying to reach me." She studied his face, searching for any sign that this was simply a convenient excuse, and found instead exactly the same desperate sincerity that had convinced her weeks ago that this dangerous, complicated man was worth the risk of falling for in the first place. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I was trying to tell you. Tell me now. Whatever it is. I'm pregnant, Antonio. It's yours. I was leaving because I didn't think a man like you would actually want a kitchen maid and a baby neither of us planned for." The silence that followed felt to Daisy like it lasted an entire lifetime. And then Antonio crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms so fiercely it nearly knocked the breath from her lungs, one hand sliding down to rest against her stomach with a reverence that contradicted everything she had ever heard whispered about him in the staff quarters. "She is mine, and so is the child she is carrying," Antonio said, though there was no one else in the room to hear it yet, the words simply tearing out of him as if he needed to say them out loud to make them real. "Whether the rest of this family approves or not. I don't want to be a problem you have to manage," Daisy whispered against his chest. "I've heard the way people talk about women like me marrying into families like yours." "You are not a problem," Antonio said, pulling back just enough to look directly into her eyes. "You are the only good thing that has happened to this family in years, and anyone who has a problem with that, including my own sister, can bring that problem directly to me." "What happened to her?" Daisy asked. "Cordelia. She did this because she didn't think I belonged here." "She will answer for the 11 weeks she stole from us," Antonio said, his jaw tight. "But you do not need to spend another moment worrying about her. That is mine to handle." The following weeks moved with the same dizzying speed that had carried Daisy through her entire relationship with Antonio. He moved her out of the staff quarters into the main house immediately, brought in the finest obstetrician in the state, and addressed his entire household staff directly within days, making it unmistakably clear that Daisy was no longer a member of staff to be managed, but the future mother of his child and, soon enough, his wife, and that any disrespect shown toward her would be treated exactly as if it had been shown to him personally. Cordelia was confronted privately, a conversation Daisy was not present for, but heard about afterward in fragments from Vittorio, who described Antonio's calm as more frightening than any explosion of temper could have been. Cordelia did not lose her place in the family entirely. She was, after all, still his sister, but she lost any authority over the household's daily affairs. Relocated to manage the family's legitimate restaurant holdings in Newport, far enough removed that her old-world opinions about bloodlines and propriety no longer had any influence over the household Daisy now called home. The real danger came in Daisy's 8th month, not from Cordelia, who had genuinely retreated after losing her position, but from an entirely different direction. Salvatore Greco, a rival capo who had spent years resenting the Rossi family's stranglehold on Rhode Island's shipping lanes, saw an opportunity in Antonio's obvious devotion to a pregnant kitchen maid, a vulnerability he had never expected to find in a man known throughout the Northeast for his ruthless self-control. Salvatore's plan was simple and brutal in its calculation. If he could not defeat Antonio Rossi through business or violence directed at the man himself, he could destabilize him entirely by threatening the one thing that had finally, visibly, made Antonio vulnerable. He sent 2 men to the small bakery in downtown Providence, where Daisy had taken to visiting twice a week, partly for the cannoli, partly because the owner reminded her of her grandmother, with explicit instructions that she was not to be harmed, only removed, held somewhere quiet until Salvatore could use her as leverage to force Antonio into surrendering control of 2 key peers. They grabbed her as she left the bakery, bundling her into an unmarked van before she could do more than drop her bag of pastries onto the sidewalk, driving her 2 hours north to an isolated property near the Massachusetts border where she was locked in a bare upstairs bedroom with nothing but a mattress and a bucket, 8 months pregnant and utterly terrified. Antonio learned of her disappearance within the hour, the bakery owner having called the house directly the moment she saw Daisy forced into the unmarked van, recognizing immediately that something was deeply wrong. What followed was, according to every man who worked for Antonio Rossi, the most frightening display of organized, controlled fury any of them had ever witnessed. more unsettling for its precision than any outburst of rage could have been. Antonio did not call the police. He called in every favor across 2 states, shut down every shipping route Salvatore Greco's organization depended on within the hour, and personally led the convoy that descended on the most likely property within 2 hours of receiving the bakery owner's call, moving with a controlled, lethal efficiency that left Salvatore's men at the gate disarmed before they fully understood what was happening. Daisy heard the commotion from inside the locked bedroom, the shouting, the sound of something heavy crashing against a wall downstairs, and then the door splintering open to reveal Antonio standing in the frame, his shirt torn, his knuckles split and bleeding, his eyes raking over her with a desperation that nearly broke through every ounce of composure he had left. "Are you hurt?" he asked, already crossing the room, already pulling her carefully into his arms, one hand sliding instinctively to her stomach. "Is the baby all right? Tell me you're both all right." "We're fine," Daisy whispered, finally allowing herself to cry now that there was somewhere safe to put the fear. "They didn't hurt us. They just wanted to use us against you." Antonio's jaw tightened, something cold and absolute settling behind his eyes. "They will never get the chance to use either of you again." Salvatore was found in the kitchen downstairs, having tried and failed to flee through a back door the moment he heard Antonio's convoy arrive, dragged into the living room to face the full weight of a decision he had clearly not thought through to its actual conclusion. "You took the mother of my child," Antonio said, his voice gone quiet in the particular way that made every man in that room go pale, including men who had known him their entire lives. "You locked her in an empty room 2 hours from everyone who loves her, 8 months pregnant because you thought my devotion to her made me weak enough to exploit." "It was business, Antonio, nothing personal," Salvatore stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow. "There is nothing more personal than this," Antonio said. "That is the mistake you made tonight, Salvatore, and it is the last mistake you will ever make against this family." What happened to Salvatore Greco after that night became, within Rhode Island's underworld, a quiet cautionary tale told for years afterward, the details never fully confirmed, the lesson nonetheless absolutely clear to anyone who heard it. Daisy never asked for specifics, and Antonio never offered them, trusting her only with the assurance that the man who had taken her would never threaten anyone again. The drive back to Providence was quiet, Daisy's head resting against Antonio's shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her, his hand never once leaving her stomach the entire way home, as if he needed the constant proof that both of them were still safe. "I should have seen this coming," Antonio said quietly, somewhere past the halfway point. "I was so focused on protecting you from my own family's disapproval, I didn't think carefully enough about the men outside it who would see you as a weakness to exploit." "You can't see everything," Daisy said gently. "Not even you." "I'm supposed to see everything," Antonio said, frustration threading through his voice. "That is the entire responsibility of who I am. The fact that I nearly failed at protecting the one thing that actually matters terrifies me more than anything Salvatore could have done to me directly." "You didn't fail," Daisy said, taking his bruised hand in both of hers. "You found us in 2 hours. Most men would never have found us at all." 3 weeks later, Daisy gave birth to a son in the Rossi family's private wing, surrounded by the best medical care money could arrange, and one enormous, visibly terrified Mafia boss who held her hand through 9 hours of labor and refused to step back even once, despite the doctor's gentle suggestions, despite his own knuckles, still healing from the confrontation with Salvatore, aching under the pressure of Daisy's grip during the worst of her contractions. When their son finally let out his first furious cry, Antonio looked at him with an expression Daisy had genuinely never seen on his face before, something completely undone and entirely whole all at once. "He's perfect," Antonio whispered, cradling the small, screaming bundle against his chest with a tenderness that seemed almost impossible from hands capable of so much violence. "He is never, for a single day of his life, going to wonder whether he or his mother are wanted in this family. They named him Matteo, after Antonio's grandfather, a small, deliberate tribute to the family Daisy had once feared would never fully accept her. The family that had instead, in its own complicated, dangerous way, made room for exactly who she was. Daisy, exhausted and overwhelmed with a love she had not fully prepared herself for, reached out and took Antonio's hand, lacing her fingers through his. "You said I was yours. Back in the kitchen," she said quietly. "You never actually asked if I wanted to be." Antonio looked up at her, something soft and certain settling into his features. "Do you," he asked, "want to be mine? Not because of the baby. Because I am asking you now, properly, the way I should have asked the morning after that first night instead of letting business pull me away for 11 weeks. Ask me properly then," she said, a small, exhausted smile breaking through. He reached into his jacket, somehow having anticipated this exact moment despite the chaos of the last several hours, and produced a small velvet box he had clearly been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment that had kept refusing to arrive. "Marry me, Daisy. Not because you're carrying my son, though I will love him every single day of my life. Marry me because somewhere in one kitchen, on one rainy night, I fell in love with a woman who fed me the first honest meal I'd had in years, and then fed my heart something I didn't even know it was starving for. I want a wife. I want a family. I want you in every version of my life from this point forward." "Yes," she said, before he had even finished opening the box completely, and the sound of their son's continued furious crying somehow made the moment feel even more real, more permanent than any quiet vow ever could have. The wedding took place 5 months later, in early autumn, in a small, heavily guarded chapel outside Providence, far enough from the city that no press ever found it, close enough that everyone who actually mattered to either of them could attend without difficulty. Daisy stood at the back of the chapel in a gown tailored exactly to her postpartum curves, with no apology built into a single seam, a soft champagne silk that Antonio's tailor, brought in specifically for the occasion, had cut to celebrate rather than minimize the body in front of him. Through the chapel doors, she could see Antonio waiting at the altar, and even from that distance, even through the blur of nervous tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, she could see the expression on his face plainly, an expression of pure, undisguised devotion that every guest in attendance, family soldiers and Providence neighbors alike, could see just as clearly as she could. Vittorio stood beside him as best man, looking faintly uncomfortable in formal wear, but fiercely proud regardless. Their son slept peacefully in his grandmother's arms in the front row, completely unaware that his existence had once nearly cost his parents everything, that he had been carried 2 hours from home in the back of a stranger's van before he was even born, that the man waiting at the altar had torn through an entire criminal network in 2 hours to make sure he arrived safely into a world that would never let him wonder whether he belonged in it. As Daisy began the slow walk down the aisle, her grandmother seated proudly in the front row, having traveled from Providence specifically for this day, she caught Antonio's eyes across the length of the chapel and watched the careful, controlled composure he wore for the rest of the world crack open completely, the same way it had the very first night she returned to that kitchen with a secret she'd been too afraid to share. When she finally reached him, when he took her hand in both of his and pressed a kiss to her knuckles before the officiant had even said a single word, he leaned in close enough that only she could hear him. "You don't have to do this because of a child that arrived before either of us was ready," he murmured. "Nobody would blame you for wanting something simpler than this life." "It was never about simplicity for me," she whispered back. "It was always about you, Antonio. From the very first night in that kitchen." "Then let's stop wasting the officiant's time," he said, the ghost of a real smile finally breaking through the emotion on his face, and the small chapel filled with quiet, relieved laughter from everyone close enough to hear it. The ceremony itself was brief and deliberate, neither of them interested in a long, performative affair after everything they had already survived together. When Antonio finally kissed her as husband and wife, it was slow and certain, the kind of kiss that settled every doubt she had carried since the morning she woke up to a note on her pillow, promising he would return before she had time to miss him, the kind of kiss that told her, more clearly than any vow recited in front of witnesses, that she had found exactly the home she never knew she was looking for. If you loved watching Daisy go from an overlooked kitchen maid to the woman a feared mafia boss tore apart an entire rival network to protect, smash that like button and share this video with anyone who needs the reminder that real love sees exactly who you are and never asks you to shrink for it. Subscribe and ring the bell for more intense, gripping mafia romance stories. What would you have done in Daisy's shoes? Tell me in the comments below.